Morning, everyone. Let's kick off this event. I'm Manu Bastran, and as council member of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this talk, and we really appreciate your presence here. Most of you know about SIIA, but for some of you might be new. So I just want to give a few bits of information about the SIIA. We are Singapore's oldest think tank. We're dated from 1962, so we precede Singapore's independence. We are a non-profit institute dedicated to independent research and analysis of events in the global and regional arenas. Of course, we focus on ASEAN, which is our particular area of strength. We also have developed a particular strength, I think, in sustainability and green-related issues. So what we try to do is to bring policymakers, business leaders, academics, and industry experts, as well as other specialists, to exchange perspectives and to hopefully drive meaningful, policy-oriented conversations. We hope that you'll find value in these discussions and consider joining us formally as members. As members, we get valuable insights and the right to join exclusive meetings with policymakers and decision makers of various kinds. Today's talk is on a very topical issue. I don't want to preempt what the panelists will be saying, so I'm just going to introduce the speakers. We are very fortunate to partner with the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore, and with us are Professor Joseph Liao, Chairman of the Middle East Institute, and Ms. Michelle Teo, Executive Director of the NEI, who will be moderating the session. Joining them as panelists will be Mr. Simon Tay, Chairman of the SIIA, and Ms. Angela Mancini, Partner and Head of Geopolitical Risk Analysis, APAC, from Control Risks. Let me just hand over the session to the moderator, and we have a very productive discussion.
Ms. Manu has done it more than competently. I see a lot of familiar faces here this morning, and I want to welcome all of you. I think because we've only got about 20 minutes, and everybody has just about 5 to 6 minutes, and I just want to give the floor to all of them. Let me just say a few things. That when we started to discuss this event and what we wanted to talk about, I felt that we should look at three aspects of it. The geopolitics. We ought to look at the international, what's happening in terms of international law and the international legal system. And finally, we do need to look at the risks that take place. So I will open by actually inviting Joseph to start, and then we will move on to Simon, and we will close off with Angela. And the reason why I wanted to close off with Angela was because this is where you're really looking at what are the risks. Now, at this stage, it's anybody's guess as to what's going to happen in the Middle East. I'd say a few things though. The region is not doomed. There has been conflict in that region for as long as anyone can remember. It dates back into antiquity. Okay, it is a very interesting, maddeningly unknowable region, but it has huge potential, and there are pockets of stability. There are some states there, countries who have been, they are civilizations, they're not going to go anywhere tomorrow. There is also a huge drive to pivot the economies and pull that region into the 21st century and beyond. So I'd say don't come here thinking that it's all doom and gloom, because it's not. But let me hand you first to Joseph, and then we will move on to Simon after that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Very good morning, everyone. In the interest of time, let me get straight to it. My beat this morning is to give, if you will, a sort of top-line big picture analysis, and I'll make a few points, and happy to sort of delve deeper into them in the course of the discussion. The first is that actually the United States and Iran, we set aside Israel for a moment, I'll come back to that. The US and Iran are aligned on one thing, and that is both want the war to end. The problem is the terms on which either wants the war to end are worlds apart. And unfortunately, because of that, despite the fact that both want the war to end, the likelihood is that it's going to intensify and escalate in the coming weeks before we even start to be able to ponder some light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah. Israel and some of the Gulf states, it's a different proposition altogether. I think the Israelis are prepared to be in it for the long haul, for better or worse. They see this as an opportunity for them to finally resolve or solve the Iran issue. Yeah, whether or not they can do that, that's a different matter altogether. The Emiratis and the Saudis, my sense is at the beginning of the conflict or in the build-up to the conflict, they had a lot of apprehension about things going kinetic, but because of what has transpired since, not least of which them being targeted by the Iranians, the stakes are much higher for them. Their approach to the conflict now has changed. So basically, Trump, you started this, you better end it. Yeah. So this is where the main protagonists are at. Second point, I think the US is in a difficult situation because of what we in the military would call mission creep. Yeah, they didn't have a clear sense of what the objectives were. Operationally on the ground, they've done, they've obliterated a lot of things, which apparently were obliterated already in June. So it's been twice obliterated. Yeah, so that's how effective and consequential it is. Yeah. But nonetheless, the expectation of a quick and decisive victory did not materialize. And we are now in this bizarre situation where Trump wants to obliterate an adversary which he has lifted sanctions on so that they can sell oil to fund the presumably effort to defend them against obliteration. Yeah, so let's try to square the circle around that one. So the underlying issue as far as the US is concerned is that they do not have a clear exit strategy at this point. Yeah. Third, I think even if the US withdraws, finds some way to withdraw, the conflict will continue. Yeah, in a different form, but it will continue. Mentioned about Israel, the Israelis have accumulated a very long list of targets over the years and decades. And now they see this as an opportunity to start checking it off. Yeah? And they are quite intent on doing as much of that as possible, which is also why they want the United States to continue to be fighting alongside them. Yeah? And also I think we know, the media headlines is all about Iran. We know another front had opened up in Lebanon. The Israeli approach is, as it has been for a while, mowing the lawn, as they call it, but I think it's a bit more complicated than that now because of the larger context. Yeah. The Iranians themselves, this conflict was an existential one for them. It was a matter of survival. I think what has happened is that the elimination of the top tier leadership of Iran has created a more hardened second tier or third tier. It has catalyzed Iranian nationalism, yeah, in ways that the regime probably would never have been able to, yeah, unless the only exception being if your country is under attack, and that this is, happens everywhere. Because the regime is more hardline now, my concern is that whereas in the past the strategy, the nuclear strategy was to attain threshold status without tilting over, now they have every incentive for purely security reasons to accelerate that effort towards becoming a nuclear state. Yeah. So that's the situation we're in now. And my last point will be that as far as Gulf-Iran relations are concerned, there's going to be a sea change. Yeah, the trust levels have significantly deteriorated. The Iranian calculation in hitting the Gulf states was number one, in the short term, to compel the Gulf states to lobby the US as far to withdraw from the region, or to sort of withdraw from the conflict. And the longer term objective was to cast doubt on the US security umbrella and commitment to the Gulf. Yeah. But I think what is going to happen is that the Gulf states are going to actually double down on that security commitment. After all, 3,000 plus projectiles were locked at the Gulf states. Some, not just American military installations, but civilian installations as well. The vast majority were shot down, right? And they were shot down by American technology, effectively. So it makes no sense actually if you were sort of in Abu Dhabi or Riyadh or Doha. It makes no sense to pull back from your relationship with the US. More likely double down. Yeah. So that's going to happen. So what the Americans hope to achieve, they're not going to achieve. What the Iranians hope to achieve, they're not going to achieve. What the Israelis hope to achieve, they're not going to achieve. Yeah? Iran's going to still be around. Iran's going to still be an adversary, and in fact, Iran is going to be more hardened. Yeah? So that's the situation we're in, I'm afraid.
Well, Joe, this is all the moments I feel like I either laugh or cry. If you see me smiling inappropriately, I find for the laugh because I think you put a lot of this very well. And Michelle, we're going to have a discussion among ourselves later. So I'm just going to focus on my points first, and then we'll try and talk to each other later. So first, Michelle asked me to talk about the public international law aspect. I do teach public international law. I wish I could teach it to Trump, because she's not listening. Very clearly, the international law of use of force and self-defense is almost no relevance here. The rules of self-defense do exist, and this isn't one of those cases where it could be invoked. In fact, quite startlingly, the Americans have put almost zero attempt to justify this in any legal terms. It's to the point where people do say the international law have any point. And I would just say, well, it's never been the main thing. I'm honestly very glad Singapore's defense, as well as some investment in international law. But I would say it's very important for third countries to talk about international law. It's trying to uphold a standard to other countries. I'm very happy in that sense that ASEAN has had an emergency meeting to express its serious concern. I think it's too much to expect a complete sort of criticism, direct criticism of America. But I think these signals are being taken by America to see that its position is untenable. The Iran retaliation will also be criticized in regard of GCC. In that sense, also the ASEAN ministers have emphasized their sympathy for we recently had a GCC, ASEAN and China summit. I think this does hopefully play well with the GCC members to know that people on this side of the world do have a view on their predicament. Now, I would say that beyond law, the implications of what Joe has said is very real. I wrote an article as well talking about we can't expect Iran to collapse. And even when the bombing starts by America, whenever that will be, the war may well continue by other means. There are so many ways of which an entity like Iran can do it directly, indirectly, through its axis of resistance partners, or through unnamed people. It can be physical terrorist attacks. It can be virtual. They've closed not just the Strait of Hormuz right now as an economic weapon. In the past, the Houthis closed the Red Sea. And I think that's my third point. That is really putting a lot of pressure on the American economy, the global economy, but particularly here in Asia. I think everyone knows that most of that oil and gas heads over to this part of the world, particularly China. But China is more resilient than most because it has domestic sources of energy. The ones who have seen most exposed actually are the North Koreans and Japanese. They have stocks, but they have no intrinsic supply for themselves. And they don't have the kind of pipeline that Singapore has with Indonesia. In our region, you can already see some of the countries having to ration. Some have played the cards very badly. For example, one of the first places to see rationing will be Cambodia. I think, happening already. Because Cambodia, in a way, besides this global problem, decided to fight with the one person who put a pipeline and supplies into Cambodia, Thailand. And Thailand have completely cut off supply to Cambodia. So I think that this will be space. I'm happy to talk about Singapore later if you want. My view is that Singapore won't be the worst hit. My last point is simply is that where this is going, where we can hope it will go. There will be this oil shock across the world. And I think that in a sense, I'm hoping to hear from Angela about the possibility that these will serve as a domestic break on what Trump is going to do. The problem of a lot of these global issues coming back to our region, or was Singapore, is that we're just a price taker. We just have to see how it plays out. We can talk about our own resilience. And I would say that's where I'm hoping that in this realization we can't affect the big things. We should turn to what we can do. ASEAN has talked about energy sharing. So there is an agreement on paper about sharing your stocks. And there are some countries like Brunei that still have enough stocks to share. Then we can also see that longer term, we have to deal with things like green energy and trying to build generation and the cross-cable sharing, cross-country sharing, to really position ASEAN as a whole, resilient to the shock. These shocks have come before, so shipping should not be too bad, but the energy aspect is relatively new and very dynamic. Let me stop here.
Working at control risks, and I have some colleagues and alumni here, usually I'm the most depressing one on the panel. Joseph and Simon are sharing negative views. But so anyway, I don't know how many of you are familiar with control risks, but we work for about 80% of the Fortune 500. We're not a think tank, although I run the geopolitical risk team for Asia. We do produce thought leadership and content and analysis, but most of what we do is in service of clients and their risks. And so what I like to do is on a no-names basis, I think there's media here, see it, but on a no-names basis, talk a little bit about what we're seeing, particularly from client side and what people are worried about and asking about and the outlook. And then also as a token American in the room, I think, can talk a little bit about what that might mean for the US domestic situation that breaks. Okay, so just a couple of brief points. Okay, number one, we are indeed seeing, we're at the precipice of what we think is a sea change in risk. We don't touch word think we're exactly there, but I'll tell you what we see our clients facing. It's now been exactly a month. Number one, it was all about safety of people and assets. Where is everybody? Can you get them out of Dubai? Are they in transit? What's kind of the immediate situation for safety? That then morphed into what is our situation with our energy supply, right? And I know some people in the room are in industries that focus heavily on that. And so that became energy supply is going, costs are going through the roof. And of course, it's not just oil and gas, LNG, it's everything related to fertilizers and kind of the knock-on impacts as well. Also seeing immediate hits to agriculture and also tourism. Okay, so a place like Vietnam is less exposed to tourism because most of their tourists come from Asia. Thailand is much more exposed because they have a lot of international tourists. So that's what we're seeing in the first instance. We're now starting to see, I'd say in the last 5 to 6 days, clients, big corporate multinationals saying to us, I had one that called me yesterday, canceled a big project, and said, it's March, our year is over. We've lost our financial targets for sure, and we've also lost our bonus. And isn't that wonderful? And again, I remind you, it's March. This is because they have factories in the Philippines that run on diesel fuel, which the price has doubled in the last week, and that's a disproportionate profit generator for them in the region. So that's not pleasant. So we're not really hearing clients talk much more about longer term planning yet. Certainly they're really quickly working out the rest of their year. We're hearing from all of our clients things like, non-essential costs and travel are cut and what have you. But we're not quite at a precipice where we're worried about something longer term. If things were to stop today, we would have an ability to some extent to digest the disruption over a period of time, right? I think what people are really watching is how long does it go on? Are the US troops that are headed in the direction going to be deployed? That changes things drastically. What are the other actors going to do? What are actors going to do in Europe? Are they getting involved? And also one we're watching is the Houthis in Yemen, because if they close the Red Sea, then everybody has to go through the Cape of Good Hope, which adds 10 to 14 days transit and up to $1 million per transit, and that would be even a bigger knock-on effect. Of course, there's also what happens to further damage of infrastructure. So if we stopped again this morning, we already have damage to infrastructure. You all know it, Qatar Gas and the rest of it. But is there further damage? So that's kind of the not so pleasant picture. But we do see, at this point, a structural increase in cost related to, again, the lack of supply of energy primarily, and a sea change in risk. And I think this was mentioned earlier, or alluded to earlier, because what we have now, what we didn't have in early February, was the Iranians thinking they could control the Strait of Hormuz. We now have a situation where they control it, and they're going to control it until someone makes them not control it. And that's now a risk factor that did not exist earlier in this year. So that's a new one. So, you know, our scenario, and then I'll move quickly to the American side, is not, unfortunately, a de-escalation. We're looking at what Trump says, which looks somewhat positive, but what he's doing with the moving of the troops and whatnot, and really there isn't any elegant off-ramp we're not seeing, and the Iranians indeed want it to stop, and the U.S. wants it to stop. Business certainly wants it to stop, but it's hard to see what the good exits are. So that's kind of where we are. Again, nobody knows and nobody can predict, but businesses are kind of bracing for the next week or two, and then we see where we are. Switching gears for a moment to the American side, I don't know if there's any other Americans in the room. I literally might be the only one. But we are seeing, obviously, domestic impact. Not that significant yet. I don't know if people saw the recent Reuters Ipsos poll that came out a day or so ago. That has Trump's approval rating down to 36%. It's dropped 4%. It's dropped a lot with independents. His approval of the economy or approval ratings on how he's handling the economy are now down to 29%. And approval ratings on the war are down. But I asked myself, does that matter, actually? If you look at the polling for the midterms, which are in November, the polling most recently, as of this morning I checked, still predicts a majority for the Senate for the Republicans and a majority for the House for the Democrats, so that would put a bit of a brake on it. But that's 7 months away. Okay, so that may indeed come to pass. Maybe the Senate even goes Democrat, but we have 7 more months. I mean, it's been a month and look what we've seen, but 7 more months. I'm not sure that's going to, you know, that feels like a long time away. The other things I'd say are the media landscape has changed. So American voters can, some of them receive a different media than you receive here. That matters. That didn't used to be the case. And then what I'd say in terms of what we're watching, there is indeed a split within MAGA. You would have seen it. Some high-profile MAGA folks have come out against the war. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Steve Bannon has even said some things. We're watching for Joe Rogan and some of the other ones kind of in the center. But watch for CPAC this week as well in Texas. So that's the big annual conservative political action committee that meets. Big MAGA group. We're looking to see the news and the speeches out of there. J.D. Vance is not speaking. Trump's not going for the first 10 in 10 years. He's busy. But we're watching for that as well. So all to say, it's a big question mark on what might happen within the Republican Party and within the rest of the voters. But again, I just come back to the fact that it's quite a long way away. And even with the brakes on the actions of the president now, they don't seem to be working. Congress has pretty much given up its right to, they're trying, right to come out and deal with the purse strings. But I'll leave you with this. They're asking for $200 billion for this war. That's more than we've spent in 3 years in Ukraine, which is $180 billion. So that may be, you know, as the American voters have seen gas go up by $1 a gallon in the last month, that may be something that does take us back to see.
Thanks very much to everybody. So, listening to what everyone has to say, there's a few things. One, we are standing now at a point where it's hard to say whether things are going to carry on as it always has, or things are really going to change quite dramatically, right? Some things are very clear. Iran's not going to go anywhere. Israel's not going to go anywhere, and the objectives that they have are unchanged. What has been the impact in the Middle East, if I look at it? The Gulf states have to do some serious thinking. Either they dig in and bite the bullet, or they really think about where they are headed and accept that they are really much more vulnerable than they may have thought they were. That the defense arrangements that they have with the US may not be enough. Where do we go from here, right? Two, I think Joe is right. The trust levels with Iran have gone. And it's interesting to see that, because I personally was very surprised by what the Iranians did, for the simple reason that, you've had under the radar relationship that has been very viable with the Gulf states for a very long time. But in trying to pressure the Americans, you have actually angered the very people who have been able to help you actually survive as well. So that's one. The second is, you look at what's going on in the US, and I don't think what Trump is doing, as awful as he sometimes sounds, I'm sorry, I'm very frank about this, okay? He does sound pretty awful, but if you think about what he's doing, it is a very business, transactional approach, right? How this plays out domestically is going to be the big thing, because that will have some kind of impact. But he clearly has a very sort of transactional approach to how he wants to deal with all this. I think that he has actually gone into this Iran issue without actually thinking it through. Iran is not an existential threat to the United States. Why would you do something like this? What is the threat to you? That is my question. And that's never been clear in any of the discussions domestically, right? The last part is the impact on this part of the world. Simon is absolutely right. Energy is going to be the big problem for this part of the world, because we all are takers, price takers, and we are at risk, right? And we have not switched over quickly enough. We have not built those networks. We've not moved to renewable energies fast enough. And that is going to create a real problem for this part of the world. Singapore is going to take a few hits. I think we're more resilient than sometimes we think we are. But we will take some hits. But we will also take hits because if the region takes hits, it's going to be a knock-on effect on us. We're so open in that sense. So that's how I see it, and I'm now going to see what you all have to say about this.
First, on the domestic part, the part I think that has yet to really figure out is whether Congress is going to try something. Because it's clearly now not a multi-operation, it's a war.
Yep.
And there is a law America, if I understand it, Angela, where the Congress actually has the power of war, shared with the, and once a war is solved, entered into, then the commander-in-chief is in charge. So a number of Democrats will try to, I think, use the legality issue both nationally. That's where the international norms, in a way, come in. Of course, they'll be talking to a rather narrow segment of people who do care about these issues. On the energy part, I just want to comment that I would put Singapore kind of a middle bracket. You need a lot of stuff that talks about how much oil and gas are you stocked with. And Singapore will not declare because it's a national security. Some countries over-declare. What I said about South Korea, according to South Korean official numbers, they're supposed to be like almost a year. But I would say that it's really much shorter, it's about 3 months. Some other sources suggest it's much shorter. Singapore's resilience comes from the fact that there's a 45% of our energy from a pipeline, which can't go anywhere else. And then we're basically plugged into a lot of different suppliers. So it's a price issue, the inflation will be there. But it's not a supply issue. What we're seeing in other countries is literally they cannot get in the oil and gas. They cannot get supply.
Maybe I'll say a quick thing about the impact on the region as well. I totally agree. The immediate issues are obviously energy supply. In addition to that, I would say also the depreciation of regional currencies against the US dollar. Just when you need stronger currencies, right, because of price pressures. So that's a double whammy as well. Third is, of course, the security of Southeast Asians who are in the region. But there are longer-term impacts as well, chief of which is the role of the US in the region, right? This perennial issue. And it cuts both ways. On the one hand, the concern, again, the perennial concern that the Middle East always sucks up all the attention, right? And then the US, you call it the pivot, rebalance, whatever Trump has in mind, that shift never quite materializes, right? Because Middle East, something happens. As Michelle said, something will always happen there, right? So there's that tension. But at the same time, at least with this administration, the unpredictability of it all. I mean, their approach of, I broke it, you own it. What implications would that have for us, right? Their approach of minimal, if any, consultation with friends, allies, partners when they decide to do something? What implications does that have on us? We always thought that the Gulf states did have some degree of influence and leverage on US administrations, not just the Trump administration, but even before that, right? But as I mentioned earlier, where the Gulf states are on this conflict has evolved over the last few weeks. At the beginning, they didn't want the conflict. They didn't want the conflict. And they made that point clear to the Trump administration. But they got the conflict anyway. Yeah? So again, this question of how much and how serious a level of consultation at least this administration has an appetite or interest for with friends, allies and partners who really want to see the US thrive and succeed. That is a question as well.
I just two fingers to follow up on what Joe said about this administration. I mean, the Americans are not unknown to go into the Middle East.
Yeah.
But the first Gulf War was really almost UN-backed. Of course, there's a particular point in post-Cold War history. But the second Gulf War, where Iraq had no uranium in the missiles in the end, the Bush administration still made a huge effort to go around and convince everyone. Of course, it also had a hard edge to it, for us or against us, right? But everybody was talked to. This one really was like, we're just doing it. You find out later in the news.
Yeah, I add a couple points there. So, first of all, our clients, particularly those in the strategy departments, are looking at, we saw after Liberation Day, obviously everyone here knows it, a diversification by countries in Asia and elsewhere, and also companies thinking about, okay, the current trade corridors aren't really working optimally anymore. Are there better trade corridors? And you saw things like Canada getting closer with India, Canada getting closer with China. Who would have thought that, right? There's a variety of these new trade corridors that are being looked at. So one question we're tracking is, do you start to see diversification of security relationships as well, right? So the trade ecosystem was, an apple cart that was upset. Are we starting to see the same thing now with security? So that's one thing we're tracking, I guess, in more broad term. More closer to home here in Asia, one thing we're looking at is the challenge, as you both have articulated quite well, of, okay, we've got rising energy prices. One thing is price, another thing is supply. But country by country, what does that mean in terms of measures? And so, for example, subsidies, okay? But then what does that mean to your budget? And in the case of a country like Indonesia, does that mean we start to cut into Prabowo's programs like the free school lunch program? Or do we not? Right now, we don't. He doesn't want to cut into that, but will he have to? If he doesn't, and things get more challenging from a cost of living perspective, do you start to see protests? You remember the Gen Z protests last year. So, do you kind of go from A to Z quite quickly in terms of cost issues then ultimately manifest in civil unrest and maybe populism and maybe even leaders changing over time or what have you. So that's another thread I would add. What I'd also add back in the States really quick, again, when we speak about domestic breaks, one thing we're looking at as it relates to the Republican Party and the MAGA constituent, which essentially is a Republican Party, are the MAGA Congress people who are vets of Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a lot of people, including some people I know on the Democrat side, that fought in Iraq and Afghanistan and then made their careers as Congress people on the back of that, and they don't want this to happen. And so it's an interesting dilemma of, are you following the leadership of the MAGA movement, which is Trump and the Republican Party, or are you really following your constituencies? Because I can promise you, if it starts to be more troops on the ground and people being injured and killed, and more troops then getting put in, it's going to be a totally different story. And that's sad, but existing break I think we also want to watch for.
That's been quite somber, quite sobering. I think really at the end of the day, at this stage, there's a lot of things to look out for, but no one can really make an accurate prediction of where we are headed, how this is going to affect different regions, what it's going to mean for us in this part of the world. I want now to open up the floor to questions.
My name is Ravi Alfreds. I work for RTX, an aerospace and defense company. we make the Patriot interceptors that was alluded to in the panel.
No wonder you're smiling.
Unfortunately, it does not happen. Right? But I have so many questions for this panel, but I'll limit it to a two-part question. Professor Liao, you mentioned about the Gulf's goals have changed. Do they envision regime change in Iran as well, aligning with Israel? That's part one. And part two is, one layer that's been missing from the narrative of this is sectarianism. Iran's a Shia theocracy. The Gulf is Sunni. Most Muslims in the world are Sunni. Is that playing in anywhere in the dialogue, and what does it mean for this region? Thank you.
Farid Alatas, National University of Singapore. I have a point about America and also about Iran. We all often say Trump is unpredictable, and I think there are superficial differences between Trump and previous presidents. But in terms of the impact, I don't think there's much difference. Whether Bush, Obama, Biden, Trump, America is an imperialist country. It has meddled in the affairs of the Middle East for decades. It is a major destabilizing force through its own direct meddling and also through its unilateral, its sort of uncritical support for Israel. And that is the root of the problem, right? Trump's language is crass. Hegseth, Rubio, Munich Security Conference talked about the glories of colonization and so on and so forth. These are all very troubling things for the whole world. Venezuela, Iran, Turkey is next, Cuba, Trump wants to take Cuba, but Obama spent billions supplying Saudi Arabia with weapons to kill Yemenis. I don't see much of a difference. I think I would focus on the issue of US imperialism. On Iran, Michelle, you said Iran, the region is unknowable. Right? I don't think it's unknowable. I've been traveling to Iran for 40 years, as well as other countries in the region. It's very knowable. I think it's distorted, right? It's demonized. Iran has been subject to British and US imperialism since the 1950s. The 79 revolution is an outcome of the installation of the Shah, who was one of the most cruel dictators in the Middle East for about 20 plus years. A lot of the things that are happening in the Middle East today, Iran's so-called axis of resistance, proxies and so on, so-called proxies, they are not proxies because the Yemenis have their own, Houthis have their own agency, Hezbollah has its own agencies. Proxy is not the right term, but whatever it is, a lot of these things are Iran's reaction to a situation, a hostile situation that they find themselves in. The joke goes, Iran did not move its country to near the US bases. The Gulf chose to compromise its sovereignty by allowing US bases, and US has 700 plus bases around the world. Which country can tolerate that, right? So I think we should really call a spade and understand the context.
Thank you. Let me just take one question here. And then I think we let the panelists answer to both these questions.
Professor Joseph mentioned that the US wants to stop the war, Iran wants to stop the war. But I think we're forgetting here that Israel doesn't want to stop the war. And to begin with, it was Israel who forced the US hand into the war. And I think they won't quit until there is absolute regime change. And you see the increasing divergence in interest between those countries. And you're also seeing increasingly obvious breakdown in coordination among those two countries. So how do you see that going forward? If the US wants to stop the war, but Israel wants to continue, they're going to go it alone. And for Iran, it is a war of, I think, existential, war of, I think, existential basis. But then for the US, it's a war of choice, right? So I think those
are very good points. I respond now. Okay, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I'll start with yours because and then it's a bit of a regime change issue as well. The Americans, Trump mentions regime change, then doesn't mention regime change. So I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. The Israeli leadership has specified that and continues to specify that. I don't think regime change is going to happen. I'm going to say why in a bit. But of course, then the second best option is basically we just cripple, weaken Iran to the point where at least they are, you know, Israel sees them no longer as a threat. They are unable to even defend themselves. Yeah, that's the second best alternative as far as the Israelis are concerned. And like I said, they've got a long list, and that list is designed to ensure that outcome. Yeah. So as far as regime change, the Gulf states don't talk about that. They want, just as Israel wants Iran neutralized, the Gulf states want Iran neutralized, because as far as they're concerned, now they see Iran as a threat. I think Farid's point is very well taken about the complexities of that, but I think their immediate calculation is that they were targeted by Iran, and therefore, you know, the alerts go up. But on this issue of regime change, I think we need to put to bed any assumption that there's going to be regime change for a number of reasons. Number one, there's no opposition. There's no united opposition in Iran. It's a social movement, right? And by virtue of being a social movement, it's decentralized. It's very effective in sustaining the opposition, but that's very different from effecting political change. Yeah, the opposition hasn't reached that point yet. Yeah. Yes, there's a lot of talk of Reza Pahlavi, but we don't know. I mean, the guy's been out of the question, out of the equation, and now he's back. We don't know how popular he is in Iran, and he's associated with a regime that the Iranians got rid of in the first place, right? And a regime that was seen to be in servitude to the Americans, right? So there's a lot of baggage there, number one. Number two, you look at the history of regime changes, this question of elite fracture, we don't see that in Iran yet. Yeah, those of you who remember Southeast Asian history, ETSA 1986, Ringo Honasan, Juan Ponce Enrile, Fidel Ramos broke, right? 1998, Indonesia, Hamoko, half of ABRI broke, right? Bolivia, right? Against the 2019, right? Military broke from Evo Morales. Right? Numerous other examples. We do not see that fracture, elite fracture in Iran yet. Right? Number three, state institutions. The state institutions, as far as I can tell in Iran, hardly a dent. Hardly a dent. In fact, it's a very good study from an organizational culture perspective, how they replenish their ranks so quickly in order to ensure that the institutions remain in place. Fascinating, we should learn that, right? In a sort of distorted way, but nevertheless. But my point is, institutions remain in place. And finally, there's no economic elite breakaway either, right? We saw that in '98 in Indonesia. And that accelerated the downfall of the Suharto regime. We don't see that again in Iran. It may happen down the road, we don't know, but we certainly have seen no indication of that.
So can I ask a follow-up?
Well, thank you. My name is Gianfranco Pesati. I'm chairman of an investment company headquartered in Singapore. You alluded to, but you didn't focus on role and posture of China in all these situations. If I may, with a sort of broken thought, but not too much, China today is the most reliable and stable area of the world in a way. So I think there is something to consider in the context of a prolonged situation of war, I guess.
Thank you. That is actually a very good question and suitably provocative. Thank you. Can I just take one more question and then?
My name is Felix Chang. I'm a fellow at University of Cambridge. I'm also a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley in California. So I just came back from California, and there's multiple Stanford professors and venture capitalists have mentioned to me that after Iran, Israel's next target is Turkey. And the intention from some of the people who told me that is Israel want to actually take very strong positions. And in Middle East, where there is no counterbalance or challenges for Israel going forward. I'm not saying that I believe in that, but I think definitely there is a belief because multiple professors at Stanford and quite well-known entrepreneurs and venture capitalists have mentioned to me that. And so, I'm not sure, what's Israel's intention, beyond regime change. And partially that's why we see, Turkey and even other Middle Eastern countries have not been very enthusiastic because I think they understood that there is actually potentially long-term consequences as well.
I say just a very quick word about China, and then I pass to you for the rest. But yes, I'll take this from a client perspective. So most of our clients obviously have big China operations. We all know the story about looking at China plus one, and in fact the Chinese looking at moving out of China as well to capitalize on building factories and supply chains outside of China. We're not seeing, we've seen a tail off in, put big tech aside. Okay, so if you're excluding some of the sectors that are highly exposed to national security issues like tech, everybody else, we've seen a tail off in clients interested in thinking about moving out. I've not yet heard clients saying we want to kind of double down back in. To the extent I'm hearing hints of it, it's coming more from Europe than the States, but you're exactly right that compared to the other options right now, the stability of China for business operations is there. And in fact, we saw this like a couple of days ago, right? There was the China Development Forum, and Xi Jinping made a big pitch to all the CEOs that were there. So I think that's definitely one to watch. And also, the other thing we're watching is, to the extent that the Gulf is, of course, big financial capital, our colleagues in Hong Kong are watching for, are we starting to see some of this capital move back into Hong Kong? And in fact, those of you who know Robin Hu, he had a lovely post a couple of days ago on LinkedIn talking about the capital moving into Hong Kong for the markets, and then the capital moving into Singapore for wealth management and treasury. So it's that movement of capital we're also watching too, but you're hitting the nail on the head.
On China, I think they are probably going to gain from this. I mean, globally, it's all going to go down, so it's not absolutely, but relatively. First, on the Chinese economy, I was just there. I feel that they've kind of leveled off. There was a kind of, about a year and a so ago, a real loss of confidence because these people never really faced a downturn. But I think the mood has changed among both the government officials I talked to as well as companies in the IT technology sector. Maybe I was entranced by Huawei and other shows. Dancing robots, they're great. Jokes aside, I think there are sort of reasons to be quite optimistic about China. Chinese themselves compared to where they were a year ago. But I mentioned earlier the energy resilience. I mean, China has multiple sources, a big stockpile, and if Iran is going to allow anything through the Strait of Hormuz, maybe at $2 million a ship, it'll be Costco. So I think China will be able to squeeze out its supply. Now, but if the global economy goes down, of course, China will take a hit. On the political side, I think China has already said it plays by the rules, etc., etc. I honestly think they don't need to come up too strongly to, pledge that they'll never make war against anybody. But it will just quietly accrue to them if America tends to lose this patient. Angela made a good point about if Americans behave this way, should you really see a diversification of security? I've softened it a bit. If I'm Japan and Korea with strong American bases there, do you know what the bases might be used for in the short term, and are you comfortable with that? What about the Saudis and etc.? And the Americans have to pull out THAAD missiles from South Korea to deploy them elsewhere. So the Americans' ability to stretch across the two and guarantee security and commitments to both sides, I think that's under a lot.
Let me touch quickly on the Turkey question. I think that's not going to happen for two reasons. Number one, if it's settle Iran and then we jump to Turkey, there you have a problem really, because you're not going to settle the Iran problem. It's going to be very long drawn. Yeah. The Israelis could open up another front. They've been opening up a number of fronts anyway. But I think my own view is that if Israel wants long-term security, that's probably not the best way to achieve it. Yeah. So, and another point about Turkey, Turkey is a NATO member. Yeah. So if Israel hits Turkey, NATO comes into play, or should come into play, who knows, right? With Trump and NATO and all that now. But theoretically, legally, right, NATO is supposed to come into play, right? So that's Turkey. In relation to China, actually, I just published a piece in Think China yesterday on this exact question. So in summary, the Chinese have made the statements that they have to make. They've been very measured. They've been very measured. The harshest statement was the reaction to Ali Khamenei's assassination. Yeah, that was the harshest statement. After that, they've been very measured, calling for calm, dialogue, restraint, that sort of the usual stuff. Why is that so? A number of reasons. Number one, China has a strategic partnership with Iran, but their relationship with the Gulf states are much more lucrative, much more substantial in trade, in investments, everything. The relationship with Iran has never really materialized in any substantial way. Yeah. There's a lot of speculation about the Chinese helping them out militarily. I don't think there's any evidence of that. Of course, some of the civilian technology, GPS navigation and things like that is being used by the Iranian military and IRGC, but at least the way I see it, it's not direct military support from China to Iran. Second is this question I mentioned earlier about US distraction, which works in China's favor. If you cast your minds back, bookmarked between two financial crises, the Asian financial crisis and the global financial crisis, was Afghanistan and Iraq. And that decade was the golden decade of China's charm offensive, which they seized, with both hands. Yeah. A lot of the difficult diplomatic entanglements that countries in Southeast Asia, for example, encounter with China today are traced back then to very effective use by the Chinese of that leverage and that opportunity when the US was distracted by the Middle East. Yeah? And also, I echo Angela's point about the Chinese looking at the potential capital flows, right, out of the Dubais of the world to Hong Kong, right? And capital is looking at those opportunities, right? Or at least recalculating. Yeah. But having said that, a final point: relations with the US. Yeah. One thing that the Chinese didn't want but had to accept was the postponement of the summit, right? And the point there is that at the end of the day, the Chinese have to calculate that they too want to stabilize relations with the US. You don't have much at stake, or you don't have significant equities at stake with regard to Iran. Why stir that to undermine this? Yeah, so it's a trade-off that they have been making, I think.
We'll take this last question, and then I would like to hand to Simon to round up.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to allow me for the last question. The reason I mentioned Turkey is not necessarily Israel will attack, but just because of the intention of the attack. And the last few years, Erdogan has been probably the most strident opposition against Israel, which I think demonstrates some behavior. I think that I just want to point that out. And 2 weeks ago, when I was back in University of Cambridge, and we have something called a Sheraton Society, which is mostly focused on geopolitics. We had Neil Ferguson came, and a few of us were actually among the fellows. We discussed about what's happening between Iran and the United States. And I think one clear message came out by Neil and multiple fellows at the University of Cambridge is the key target of the United States, which is objective is very different from Israel, is China. Right? And Neil mentioned that he became American citizens in 2018, and he is currently writing the biography for Henry Kissinger. And he is talked to multiple parties within the United States, and it is intention. It's not about just inflation, economics, and elections. It's also about and have very sharp focus on China as well. And So my understanding is there is also intention that not too much resources and time and to be distracted, and the focus has to be come back to China, and that's another perspective.
Elephant in the room. Israel is an expansionist state. Smotrich has said that southern Lebanon up to the Litani River should be permanently part of Israel. The idea of Greater Israel is no longer a secret. Decades ago, if you said Greater Israel, you are anti-Semitic. But today, they themselves admit that that's their project. So, Iran is probably the only anti-imperialist, anti-Israeli, expansionist state in the region. Nothing to do with nuclear weapons. The problem is Iran is anti-Israel expansion. And Turkey is cited by the Israelis to be also such a state. That is why you have all of this problem. And that's the elephant in the room, because we don't talk about that.
True. Okay, and on that note, I will hand to Simon.
I'm going to wear a different hat as chairman of the Institute, just to thank you all, and especially the Institute for making this possible. I would say a bit of caution. We've been very frank as possible, even though the press is here. The frankness is important, but the caution is that we really don't know where this is going. I think all of us have to admit that. When I first contacted Joseph to talk about doing this, we were like in the first week, and we casually said, well, maybe at the end of the month, be slightly more stable. I think if we hadn't already fixed the date, we probably wouldn't have chosen now, because it's not stable. And one of the stabilities is trying to read Donald Trump's mind. The man who's trying to win the Nobel Peace Prize, I think he's given that up. So, we don't really see the breaks. That's why I tried to pin the one America in the room about the domestic breaks. Though we look at international affairs, we look at what the GCC allies, or what ASEAN might say, what international law might say, it goes back to some very particular nationalistic impulses. And I think I've been educated by this emphasis on how Israel is playing into that American Trump calculation. I often thought the tail can't wag the dog, but I don't know, it seems to be able to. There seems to be a certain complex. But let me go back to thanking everyone. Ultimately, we will be looking further down the road at some of these issues. But for the Institute, though we look at international affairs, though we are very happy to team up with the Middle East to really draw on their expertise, not just Joe, but you can see that Michelle knows a lot, right? The question then comes back to what does it mean for us here in Singapore, our region? And I think that we're just beginning to really see the impact, because it depends what happens next. So the Institute, the SIIA, will be holding further talks about sustainability, world resources. We had planned this in a time which is quite benign relatively. It was mainly about European trade rules, but the impact on markets, the availability of fertilizer, all this will really be happening. We'll be also looking at talk about tariffs, which was the previous turbulence. But maybe every April, under the Trump administration, we expect a new turbulence. And so really, I think that we will be hopefully able to engage these issues as they emerge and draw you out into trying to think more deeply about how these global events affect Singapore and our region. So please join me in thanking Michelle, who chaired it wonderfully,